Hi everyone, my name is Matt Geiger, and today I'll be doing a book review of Ron Powers' No One Cares About Crazy People, The Chaos and Heartbreak of Mental Health in America. I'd like to start by briefly discussing the title of this book. The title actually came from an email that was drafted by an aide working in a Milwaukee County hospital several years ago. Obviously, an email like this was never meant to go public, but I think the title does accurately summarize the kind of feelings and attitudes that Powers experienced while writing the book. As far as my initial reactions to this book go, I would like to say I enjoyed it, but during the preface of the book, Powers does explicitly say, "I hope you do not enjoy this book. I hope you are wounded by it, wounded as I've been in writing it." In keeping with his wishes, I will say that I did find this book very interesting and intriguing. I was actually kind of surprised to have developed this opinion about the book. I'm a pretty avid reader. I have plenty of experience with reading nonfiction books, but I'm normally not used to reading books with such personal stories at their heart. I've always tended to lean towards not as personal biographies about major figures in history or big events in history. I really like reading stories about large-scale events, but I think part of the reason that I enjoyed No One Cares About Crazy People so much is that it actually uses the story of a single family to address a much larger epidemic facing our society. The mentally ill community is frequently shunned by modern society, and when they're not being criticized for their contrasting demeanors, they're often unfairly seen as pitiable. But Ron Powers refuses to accept this. As a father to two sons who were both diagnosed with schizophrenia, Powers uses his experiences depicted in this book in an attempt to humanize the mentally ill and to deconstruct any preconceived notions one might have of someone suffering from a mental illness. This is a very thought-provoking and well-written book, although I did have a few minor problems with it as I read it. I definitely would recommend this book to anyone who plans on pursuing a degree in psychology, anyone who knows someone who has experienced or is currently experiencing mental health issues, or someone who feels compelled enough to seek reforms in the current mental health care system. Having said all that, let's jump into the book. So Powers divides up this book into two separate stories that interweave throughout. The first story is the story of his family. Powers discusses in great detail his marriage and the upbringing of his two sons, Dean and Kevin. He takes the reader into some especially dark subject material. Powers talks about the various incidents that led to the decline of Dean's and Kevin's respective mental states to the point where they were both diagnosed as schizophrenic. Powers mentions at the beginning of the book that his younger son Kevin tragically made the decision to end his own life because of the debilitating effects of his schizophrenia, and reading the book with this knowledge makes his story all the more profound. I think Powers' venture into his personal life is one of the greatest strengths of this book. It's pretty hard not to feel empathetic towards Powers and his struggle because his approach is one of open honesty. He tells several stories about his sons, both happy and tragic, and he even inserts a few email exchanges between himself, Dean, and Kevin. Powers' personal anecdotes creates the sense that his family is struggling to stay afloat and that they only have their love for one another to combat the pain and torture that comes with mental illness. It's very easy to tell that Powers did not enjoy writing this book, but there is a sense of hopefulness to it, as Dean was eventually able to ease the effects of his own schizophrenia through proper medical care and family support. Powers writes this book as if Dean's gradual rehabilitation is a sign that they could have done so much more to help Kevin. When Kevin first started to experience the symptoms of schizophrenia, it was mistaken for the stress that teenagers typically face during their high school years. Eventually he was misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder, and by the time he was correctly diagnosed with schizophrenia, Powers felt as if it was almost too late to save his son. The tragedy and urgency of his son's battle with schizophrenia and the alienation from their community is very human. The humanity with which Powers writes this book doesn't just stem from the fact that he's a father. It also stems from the fact that all of us are humans. We may not all look the same, and our minds may not function quite the same way, but one of Powers' central messages to this book is that there is humanity within all of us. He expresses his desire for those who suffer from mental illness to not be viewed as immediate dangers to society, and he expresses this desire because he has simultaneously seen his family uninformed about the dangers of mental health and enlightened by the support that allowed them to slowly ease their pain. The second part of this book acts as more of a social history that serves as an inquiry into how American society has dealt with mental illness in the past. I'd like to say that even though the social history aspects of No One Cares About Crazy People are just as important as the memoir sections when it comes to understanding how and why mental health issues are such a problem in today's society, I didn't find this part of the book as engaging as the story of the Powers family. In my opinion, this is only because Powers is a father first, and therefore I feel as if the social history parts didn't quite affect me as much as his personal anecdotes did. Whenever I read a chapter that was written from a scientific or historical context, My mind was usually on the next chapter regarding the Powers family and their struggles, because the manner in which Ron Powers wrote this book resulted in me connecting more with his family than with the factual information that he threw at me. This is entirely subjective, though. It's just something that I viewed as a minor weakness as I read the book that did very little to lessen the impact that the book had on me overall. As a journalist and historian, Powers has authored and co-authored several books in the past, including the famous World War II book Flags of Our Fathers, about the soldiers who raised the American flag during the Battle of Iwo Jima. I think Powers is pretty qualified to present this type of history to the reader because of his experience with the subject matter. At first, he offers his own definition of schizophrenia, discussing the symptoms and cognitive effects of the disease. He discusses how the development of schizophrenia can lead to hallucinations and delusions, and how these in turn can lead to reckless and destructive behavior. Powers then relates several historical events regarding mental illness in general. These events include the abuse of patients at the Bedlam Hospital in London during the 1700s, and the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill in America during the latter half of the 20th century. What I liked about the historical events that he describes is that most of them are cause and effect situations that exemplify why the disadvantages of the mentally ill community are more prevalent than ever. Learning about these events introduced me to new concepts that I was either previously unaware of or didn't understand how to use in an appropriate context. One of the concepts that I found to be most intriguing was eugenics, which was a movement based on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Eugenics is all about manipulating biological systems to refine reproduction, and its application by the Nazi Party during the Final Solution and the American government during their sterilization program symbolizes how great scientific discoveries can often lead to extremely disastrous consequences. I think this is something that Powers equates with the chaos of mental health in America. He uses the results of these events as the foundation for a much larger discussion about how mental illness is dealt with today, and it's here that he fuses both aspects of the book together in a much more coherent manner. Powers elaborates on how misinterpretations of the past and deinstitutionalization have forced the mentally ill out of their private healthcare facilities and into much larger, overcrowded facilities. The lack of resources necessary to properly care for these individuals has resulted in prisons becoming the largest facilities to house the mentally ill today. Powers takes the link between mental health and incarceration very seriously because of the legal problems his son Dean endured after being sued by the parents of his friend after a car accident. Though Dean was never incarcerated himself, he was placed on house arrest for a long period of time, and the trauma of the incident left him feeling even more detached from society. Powers views his son's sentencing as one of the prominent factors of his development of schizophrenia. Over 2 million people are currently incarcerated in American prisons, and well over half of these individuals suffer from some form of mental illness. These illnesses are frequently brought upon by the physical and psychological abuse they endure behind bars, and the lack of proper medical care that comes as a result. Though the oppression of mentally ill prisoners is at a bit of a contrast to Dean's struggles, Powers manages to unify the two. He believes that his son was shown the mercies of an unmerciful world, and he hopes for the same mercy for others who suffer from schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. In my concluding thoughts, I'd like to share with you a particular word I discovered while reading this book: anosognosia. Anosognosia is a Greek term in English translates to without knowledge. In terms of how this relates to the topic of mental health, anosognosia refers to the falsely held belief of a mentally ill person that nothing appears to be wrong with them. What struck me about this word is something that Powers makes known by the end of the book. Even human beings who are of a perfectly healthy mental state can still suffer from their own form of anosognosia because of their collective denial and obliviousness towards the needs and humanity of the mentally ill community. Powers intends for this book to comfort families currently dealing with the atrocities of the mental health system, and to spur into action those who are compelled enough to seek the necessary changes. After reading No One Cares About Crazy People and discussing it in my critical thinking class, I feel that I have a much better understanding of mental illness in general and the feelings of oppression that are currently running through many families in America. Before reading this book, my knowledge of mental illness really only consisted of the basic types of mental illness in their simplest form. But this book has particularly enlightened me about schizophrenia and how it has the ability to completely debilitate an individual and a family as a result. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who hopes to study mental health in the future or make an effort to benefit those who are currently suffering from mental illness. Reading No One Cares About Crazy People has forced me to consider how I would feel if I experienced or personally knew someone who was experiencing mental illness and felt disadvantaged or oppressed as a result. I've never had any ill will towards the mentally ill community, but this book has encouraged me to do more than simply recognize them as fellow human beings. I feel rather inspired to help them seek the equality that they properly deserve, and my hope is that if you were to read No One Cares About Crazy People, you would feel the same way. Thanks for listening.